Morning. If I can ask everyone to please get their coffees, top that off, find their seats. We've got an exceedingly busy schedule today, an awful lot of fantastic speakers who bring so much insight to a very complex set of issues, both in terms of breadth and depth, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to address those issues in the time allotted that they deserve. Anyone who knows me knows I've rarely had an unspoken thought, but I'll try to keep my thoughts to as little as humanly possible today. But I did want to welcome everyone. We're delighted to co-host this with Ellen McCarthy and INSA. I would also like to thank our various sponsors who made the day possible. Most of our events are in very short periods. Once you go over an entire day, it ends up costing quite a bit, and we could not have done that without the wonderful support of our sponsors here today. I'd rather than frame out the issues, we have so many eminent people to help us with that. What I'd like to do is turn it over to my co-host and colleague, and she will in turn introduce Charlie Allen, who we had the distinct pleasure of hosting last week to give his 50-year reminiscence on the intelligence community, and quite honestly, he's been there, done that, and has one of the most fascinating histories I think any of us could entail. So on behalf of GW, thank you, welcome, and Ellen, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think Frank said all of our thanks. It's been an incredible opportunity to co-host this event with George Washington University. So thank you very much, Frank, for initiating the dialogue. And as you mentioned, also thank you to our sponsors. Many of them who have been participating on a task force at INSA, our cyber task force. They include BAE, CSC, General Dynamics, Mantech, Northrop, and Kinetic North America. We're very grateful for your support. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I am looking forward to seeing many of you tomorrow. We're having another session tomorrow, which will be a classified session and a follow-on to this event, so we hope you can make it. And with that, I'd like to introduce a man who needs no introductions, Mr. Charlie Allen, who has been gracious enough to serve as our senior intel advisor at the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. In all honesty, I come to work every day knowing who it is I work for, and very proud and grateful that Charlie is at INSA to sort of help me guide INSA's activities throughout the year. So Charlie, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you, Frank. I do feel at home here since I am a member of the steering committee of Frank's Homeland Security Policy Institute, where she is president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. So it's good to be part of both worlds. All of you have looked at today's agenda, or you're looking at it now, and I think it's incredibly impressive. It's a stunning array of some of the best minds of this country on cybersecurity and the challenges posed. We are, of course, honored by having the Defense Minister, the Honorable Jaak Aaviksoo of the Republic of Estonia here, and I just had an opportunity to speak to the Minister. And I'm sure he will give us some very interesting insights into what happened in the spring of 2007. There was really a major distributed denial of service attacks. The attacks, as you recall, swamped the numerous Estonian organizations, including the parliament, the banks, the ministries, newspapers, broadcasters. Very interesting, very serious event that occurred in one of America's allies, and a lot of lessons there for all of us. The agenda is ambitious, I think, as Frank said. We'll hear about the cyber threat. Cyber threat has grown more dire. John Russick and my friend, we were working cyber issues back in the late 90s very hard, something called Moonlight Maze, but those seemed like light years ago because they were really very crude compared to where we are today. We'll also have people talk about how we may be able to deter. Deterrence is an interesting word because I've spent a lot of my career in recent years working terrorism, and the problems of deterrence there is different. We do not have successful strategies in place to deter terrorism, nor do we have strategies in place today to deter cyber attack, or at least mitigate the effects of those attacks. Because these attacks are affecting every level of our society, government, at all levels, the private sector, and the intellectual property and privacy of every citizen. Everyone has been touched one way or the other by intrusions. Well, I look forward to learning today about deterrence, about solutions, and how we can begin to work together on cybersecurity. Late this afternoon, we have the INSA Cyber Task Force that Ellen referenced to explain how they examined public-private models, quite a number, for relevance to cybersecurity and for a recommended approach. I think your candid comments on the INSA's work will be very much welcomed. Of course, at lunch today, we have the honor of having the Honorable Susan Collins, ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, speak to us on cyber. I had the pleasure over the last several years of dealing directly with Senator Collins as the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at Homeland Security. I found her very able, very capable person. You are aware that she and Senator Lieberman are working on legislation, which is very important legislation that will be, I think, if passed and approved, will be very vital for the country. Although neither is present today, I do believe, I'm speaking personally here, we all owe a debt of gratitude to Vice Admiral retired Mike McConnell, former Director of National Intelligence, as well as Melissa Hathaway, who led the Interagency Task Force on Cybersecurity for Admiral McConnell, and then did the 60-day policy review for President Obama's administration. I remember sitting in the White House with Admiral McConnell and Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff talking about cybersecurity in June of 2007, after Admiral McConnell had fully explained to all concerned, including the President of the United States at the time, the gravity of what we face. It was a very sobering discussion with Admiral McConnell, who's been a friend of mine for more than 20 years. More than anyone else, I believe Mike McConnell and Melissa Hathaway's efforts helped stimulate and lead to the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative and the issuance of a presidential directive, which is to address this whole critical national security issue. President Obama has said that cyberspace is a strategic asset that must be safeguarded from attack as a national security priority. So cyberspace means a lot to this president. He is concerned that critical infrastructure, public and private, are vulnerable to hackers, cyber terrorists, organized criminal syndicates, and hostile foreign governments. Cybersecurity should be a nonpartisan issue, although how this threat will be met will probably be debated intensely and politically, especially on how you can deal with cybersecurity and accomplish or mitigate threats to this country while ensuring the privacy, civil rights, civil liberties of all Americans. As a Homeland Security, those issues were constant in our minds and Secretary Chertoff's minds. So as we do Homeland Security, as we do domestic intelligence, that forbidden word, we have to do it, preserve all the civil liberties that we possess today. Well, the timing of this conference cannot be more propitious, because this is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. After all, Twitter was a victim of attack, maybe coming from Eastern Europe, took down the social network for most of the day back in August. Facebook and LiveJournal were also attacked. So the cyber threat is a universal one because the government uses the same networking, the same internet protocols, and the same operating systems as the private sector. The weapons in the hacker's arsenal are easily obtained from international cyber arms dealers who sell malware and botnets programs through online actions, just like going on eBay. It's all there. Some progress is being made, and again, I'm pleased we're having this conference on Monday, following Friday's announcement by Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano's dedication of what is called the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. It has a wonderful acronym called INCIC, I think that's the way it's pronounced, which brings together a number of government organizations responsible for protecting cyber networks and infrastructure and private sector partners. In the dedication, Secretary Napolitano stated that the INCIC will serve as a central repository for cyber protection efforts of the civilian side of the federal government and its private sector partners. INCIC combines two Homeland Security operational organizations that you're familiar with, the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or U.S. CERT, with which I was familiar, where I put a number of officers when I was at Homeland Security, and the National Coordinating Center for Telecommunications, the NCC. U.S. CERT, as you know, is a public-private partnership aimed at protecting and defending cyber infrastructures, helping to protect the 18 private sectors, while the NCC is the operational arm of the National Communication Systems, the NCS, which I hope you all know goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you don't, you should know that. INCIC will also integrate the National Cyber Security Center, the NCSC, which coordinates operations among the 6 largest federal cyber centers. As we all know, however, the establishment of the INCIC is only the beginning of what is certain to be a long, difficult, and complex road before we can have improved cyberspace security. Within cybersecurity, there is one leitmotif, and that issue is that of privacy. Concerns by individual Americans about the security of their personal data online. In this context, I'd like to bring you the results of a recent poll prepared by Penn, Schern, Berlin Associates in partnership with the Chertoff Group, where I serve as a principal. The poll was conducted in August and involved 1,000 people of the general population. Has a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. The key findings may not be surprising. First, Americans are highly concerned about the security of their personal data online. Most have little confidence in any institution to keep their information adequately protected. More than 4 in 5 Americans, 81% of respondents, are concerned about their personal data online. Over 50% are deeply concerned. Second, anxiety over online security splits dramatically along age lines. 85% of the population, 35 and unders, are concerned about online security, versus only 69% of ages of 65 and over. Young Americans are more concerned with online security and more likely to trust the federal government to protect their information. The higher anxiety among younger people is likely due to the fact they're familiar with the internet in general. They have a greater understanding of its risks. Third, Americans are unfamiliar with and concerned about many new technologies. Few realize how many technologies with privacy implications they are already using in their everyday lives. Only a small number of Americans appear to realize They're already exposed to cloud computing through their web-based email and location-based ads through sites like Facebook and MySpace. As a result, most Americans, not and probably understandably, are failing to take even the most fundamental steps to safeguard their information, like regularly changing their passwords, leaving them extremely vulnerable to attack. Fourth, Americans are willing to accept more limited capabilities in return for greater security. At least that's what the poll indicated. At least in theory, most Americans value security and privacy over power and efficiency. This finding has potential implications for the future of technology companies, especially those whose focus has traditionally been on the cutting edge, where innovation is focused, not communications. Thus, security or the appearance of it could potentially trump innovation for the American consumer. Fifth, Americans' greatest fears center around active threats, not too surprising, identity theft and hacking. Their lowest fears are of accidental theft or government and corporate malfeasance, which I think is interesting. Well, I would say these findings are not terribly revolutionary or unexpected, but they do reinforce the need for greater urgency in moving forward on all fronts with CNCI. Today, this symposium gives us the opportunity not only to advance our understanding of the threat, but to offer ideas on how to mitigate the effects of attacks. And it also, as you've read the agenda, we hope to have some solutions on what to do next. I want to thank you for the opportunity to sort of frame the issues. I'll turn it back to Frank to introduce the Minister of Defense.
Thank you for framing out the day. It is, and before we delve into the panels to address some of the specificities we laid out, I have the pleasure of introducing our morning keynote speaker, Minister of Defense of Estonia, Jaak Aaviksoo. I might note that he assumed his role as minister in April of 2007, just 1 month before Estonia witnessed a major set of cyber incidents that brought about critical questions such as Article 5 and what is an act of war in cyberspace. All the issues we're all still struggling to define here, which hopefully we can get a little more clarity. I'm delighted, and he's very comfortable in the halls of academia. Prior to becoming the defense minister, he was the rector of the University of Tartu. We were talking earlier about the ages of universities, and if I'm not mistaken, Tartu goes back to 1632. So I think their university trumps, including one named after our founding father's namesake at George Washington University. But in addition to playing a role in a leadership capacity at the university, he's a physicist by training, and has overseen and written hundreds of technical papers that have been published, widely cited, so comes to these issues with real deep, hard science expertise. Now he's got to struggle with not only the hard sciences, but the soft sciences of policy as well. I might underscore that it's especially notable for me to be able to introduce the defense minister, because I actually am of Estonian descent. My mother, who has never come to any of my events, I was able to drag here today because she is a survivor of World War II in multiple war camps. She lost all of her family as well from World War II. And my grandfather fought in support of Estonian independence against both the Germans and the Soviets. So for a country this big, getting caught in between two juggernauts is no easy feat. But without further ado, Mr. Minister, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all that you do, and the floor is yours. So thank you.
and gentlemen, let me first thank the organizers for offering the opportunity to address this wonderful and most advanced audience on cyber security. Before proceeding with my presentation today, I'd like to use this opportunity and to recall my first visit to US that took place 28 years ago when I was still what might be called a promising young Soviet laser physicist. It was in the times of Star Wars, and laser technologies were considered to be part of the standoff between the then two superpowers, and then as a move for increasing mutual trust, and the presidents or the president and the Secretary General agreed to organize an event for US and Soviet laser physicists so that they can exchange views on not only on science but also the potential technological developments and threats to world security. This took place under fundamentally different circumstances than our discussion today, but nevertheless I came here in those days from an Soviet-occupied Estonia, never dreaming of my country really becoming an independent state, which was to come in less than 10 years. That was beyond possible, but it happened to be possible, and that's clearly something that I'd like to thank this great nation who's kept the non-recognition policy alive for 50 years and put their effort and their pressure based on the ideals of freedom in place after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Unfortunately, the world's not much safer today. It's more complicated, it's much more controversial, and now coming closer to the topic of cybersecurity, I'd like to say I personally do believe that all that may be called cyber is very essential, intrinsic to the modern world, modern threats. And basically cyber threats challenge the way we perceive security in very many respects. And even more so, the way we address challenges. The concept of military and civil, or let's take it combined, the comprehensive approach, very much embedded in the very logic. Symmetry and asymmetry, fundamentally embedded in the intrinsic logic of the cyber reality. Terrorism. A lot that's going on in cyberspace, attacks has a strong terrorist component whenever it takes place. In addition to practical technological threats, we clearly see a component that addresses our integrity, how we feel ourselves, how we psychologically safe. This component is always there. Or take communication. Increasingly more important how we communicate things, not only how things are, how they are perceived, and how to influence that perception through different manipulations in the virtual reality. Public-private partnerships. I'm increasingly convinced over time after the Estonian attacks and trying to devise an Estonian national strategy or discuss the topic with our NATO partners, that it is fundamentally linked to communication to the very grassroots level. It was mentioned here already what the practical awareness is of practical users of those electronic devices that form the platform of the cyberspace. So a number of modern, or if you like, postmodern phenomena that have to be somehow integrated into our both inland as well as global security structures. So a fundamentally interesting field conceptually. And of course, very, very important from the point of view of our national security and national securities within the greater North Atlantic Alliance. Now let me still go further with the topic of cyber deterrence, although I'll build a number of links to other areas not that directly related to cyber threats and cyber deterrence. The aggressive spread of cyberspace into our everyday lives, from our home or work PCs to traffic lights on the streets, the electricity grid, airports, travel, is a process that has been magnified by a general process of globalization. It's part of that. This dual process has put most of us on this planet into close contacts. We are much closer. Becoming closer means also becoming vulnerable. Our personal spaces merge more than ever before. This contact that not all people necessarily, especially outside the Western world, desired or hoped for. I will not make a mistake and wander into the reasons behind this conflict between fundamentalism and Western culture, but it appears evident that while on one side of the conflict that carried the globalization, this part of the global community was clearly more prepared than to meet its effects than the other side. Of course, now fundamental groups have learned to use the methods of the perceived enemy, and in many cases, for instance in recruiting, but equally for negative public diplomacy, they tend to use the technology even better than we do. We've all taken the issue of communication deep into our hearts and minds. We know that it's the key to talking effectively to our respective audiences. Especially as politicians, we need the public mandate to initiate new policies, and we need the support to carry them out. This shared understanding is especially evident in defense and security policy affairs. Most of us in NATO adhere to the conclusion that one of our primary shortfalls in operating out of area, out of our comfort zone, is strategic communications to both our home and abroad populations. But what is worse is that the enemy, using new capabilities, is in very many cases better than we are, if better is measured by impact. Just one example. NATO strategic communication policy dictates that it should adhere to the following principles, and I quote. First, accuracy, clarity, and timeliness. Second, consistency and coherence of message across all levels of command. Third, active engagement in the information environment, including public electronic communications with an emphasis on speed and responsiveness. Fourth, ensuring credibility of NATO's communications by fostering relationships of mutual trust with media representatives. Further, effectiveness, that is as far as possible clearly defined, measured, and reviewed. Multiplicity of efforts and maximum reach, engaging all of NATO communications capabilities and all available communications platforms to strengthen the dissemination of consistent messages. And last but not least, soliciting public views and adapting efforts as necessary. Have we been able to implement that? Have we been successful in achieving our goals? I'm not that sure. We haven't come up to that challenge. Even worse, with a few nuanced modifications, the enemy in Afghanistan is here and there even more effective than we are in all the above aspects. Cyberspace has become a crucial part of the modern society. Or maybe the other way around. Maybe we should say that a significant part of society has moved into cyberspace. As an example, in Estonia, Even national level decision making has moved into cyberspace. As some of you may know, we had an e-voting on local elections and an e-voting on national elections 2 years ago. This time 25% of the votes cast by electronic means. What we used to have for is an ID card and a digital signature, but most probably soon the next elections will give a possibility to use our cellular phones to take part in parliamentary elections. General Robert Smith, after resigning from his post as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, wrote a brilliant book about the utility of force. He rightly divides the development of war through history into 3 phases: interstate industrial wars, the Cold War, and lastly, and most importantly, the postmodern, the war amongst people. This is exactly why cyberspace fits in very well, as controlling cyberspace gives you the potential to achieve victory before a kinetic shot is fired. This last sentence, by the way, is a quotation from the US Air Force Cyber Command strategic vision. Cyberspace brings a number of things in a most remarkable ways together. Communication, closeness to the people, strategic messaging, raising awareness, terrorizing, threatening, all components of the modern war amongst people. This is a battlefield in a much broader sense than we tend to believe when we think about the technical vulnerabilities, the denial of service attacks, or planting viruses into our computers, corrupting our data. It's more than that. It's no surprise that 2 years after the attacks in Estonia, several governments have taken on very high political agenda the problem of cybersecurity onto strategic discussion. I think the world has come a long way since May 2007, or rather April-May 2007, when the current issue broke out of the usual cloak of secrecy that has covered cyber affairs into the public domain. And I'm of the opinion that raising this as a very public issue, we did a great service to the cyber community, as it attracted a lot of political and media attention instantly. Since then, as a good example, the President of France has presented a new white paper on defense and national security. Importantly, in our context, among 15 prescriptions for France, it prescribes cyber war as a major concern for which the white paper foresees 2-pronged strategy. First, a new concept of cyber defense organized by a new Security of Information Systems Agency, and secondly, establishment of an offensive cyber war capability, part of which will come under the Joint Staff and the other part will be developed within specialized services. I won't have to add that the French white paper signals possible major attacks against information systems as one of 7 major vulnerabilities of France of today. The US intelligence community's presentation of its 2008 annual threat assessment featured cyber threats for the first time. Of course, our American colleagues within the framework of the Air Force and the National Security Agency have dealt with these issues for decades. But on a strategic level, it's for the first time when it has been raised that high. The placement of cyber threats in the assessment was right between the Indo-Pakistani nuclear dynamic and the security of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. And as many analysts agree, this placement did not happen by accident. Politically, this also means that cyber warfare doctrine concepts get more funding, hopefully also with appropriate results. More interestingly, the Americans have formed a provisional US Air Force Cyber Command which formally standing up on October 1st this year. This reflects an intellectual understanding of the challenges that shape a large part of the work of our defense forces of the future. Cyber attacks now have the attention of the world's national security plans. In the US, enhancing cybersecurity is one of the 6 mission objectives of the 2009 Director of National Intelligence Strategy, and countering the cyber threat is currently the 3rd highest priority of the FBI, after preventing terrorist attacks and foreign intelligence operations. So we've gone a long way. Raising awareness, global visibility, media coverage, cyber commands of different sorts, practical action, number of conferences, an increasing number of conferences in different levels, not only in Europe and US, but worldwide. Back to cyberspace. The recent monograph produced by the RAND Corporation for the US Air Force addresses the complex and challenging nature of cyberspace in a very precise and fitting manner, stating, cyberspace is its own medium with its own rules. I don't know as yet whether we've developed appropriate tools to handle that new reality in an appropriate way. I don't believe as yet we do have the proper metrics to describe this space and the possible events in that space, especially at the interface point where technology meets human minds. At this interface, most of the events happen. The greatest vulnerabilities take place at that interface. Equally importantly, from the same book, but pronounced previously by very many analysts, cyber attacks are not enabled through the generation of force, but by the exploitation of the enemy's vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities are intrinsic. You can do away most of them over time, but the more will emerge as a result. Differently from a missile that may be built into doing exactly what's meant to do. Any construction in cyberspace increasingly has a component of unpredictability and vulnerability. Cyber attacks are possible because systems are flawed. Errors, but as said before, errors can be corrected. Lasting defenses are then again impossible to build because the new vulnerabilities emerge. Cyberspace is riddled with ambiguities about who attacked and why, about what they achieved or whether they achieved altogether anything, whether they can do so again. With many attacks, including those mounted against Estonia, we have no way of actually knowing whether they were a precursor to something bigger still to come, or the enemy has reached its maximum capabilities of attack. Of course, as we usually do, we assume the former, but there is still hidden potential on the alien side to go even further. But there's no way to know. And even if we are capable of defending against attacks using measures and techniques that work today, they may not work tomorrow. Exactly because they were efficient today. We have to take note of the macro trends which shape the framework of this subject. We live in the era where cyber war capability development takes place at a great pace. Cybercrime is sponsored by both nation-state actors and private businesses. Attacks have become carefully directed with desired effects and with hidden motivations. Malware, virus, and so on are spread through innocent websites run by ignorant and non-liable owners. security inadequacies are ignored, holes are left unpatched, and so on and so forth. Cryptography, on the other hand, has become part of mass practice. Automated attack networks, botnets, are endlessly manipulated to great effect. By the way, most of the computers used in the attacks against Estonia were physical in the United States and China. Russia came in on the 7th place. That is just a very simple example of how complicated things are. In this environment, who exactly do we want to deter from planning and executing cyber attacks? Kenneth Greers from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, currently working at the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, has recently written a paper on deterrence strategy and their applicability in the cyber domain. As he stated, and I believe the majority of these consensual statements in the field, that in theory, nation states have two primary deterrence strategies. First of them is denial of access. For instance, in nuclear deterrence, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other technologies. We are trying to impose them on Iran, for instance. But in principle, in cyberspace, the same deterrent approach may be used. And the second one is retaliation or punishment. Of course, we come to the problems of asymmetry, of attachment, of the problems of attribution, and so on and so forth. But basically, these are the two options. Both strategies have three basic requirements: it's capability, communication, and credibility. I have to admit that personally I am quite pessimistic about the applicability of deterrence in the current legal and moral settings that we operate in. And I completely agree with Ken Greer's conclusion that denial is unlikely due to the ease with which cyber attack technology can be acquired, the immaturity of international legal frameworks, the absence of an inspection regime, and the perception that cyber attacks are not dangerous enough to merit deterrence in the first place. And last but not least, I would add to this, these arguments, the very fact that its cyber attacks are based on vulnerabilities. When being attacked at your vulnerability, it is broadly perceived that part of the problem is with the one who's been attacked, with the victim. This psychological perception is at least one of the reasons behind the fact that the moral assessment of different cyber attacks of various kinds, be it working on viruses or corrupting government or even security-related networks, is not considered a major crime by our people. Attacking a bigger party through its vulnerabilities is a Robin Hood type of attack. And if that is true, that makes it very complicated to retaliate, to make this retaliation act acceptable. You can always hide behind being a weaker partner in that standing. Well, attribution, as usual. The attribution of certain deeds to individuals, physical personalities or legal entities is a big problem also in real life, but increasingly and even more so in cyberspace. Evidence. I think we have to carefully analyze what we mean practically when we say we have evidence beyond reasonable doubt in virtual reality. This is not only a theoretical, it's also a very practical question. Most probably, this will emerge in the process of doing, of precedence. And we've only started. It's a long way to go before we establish a general understanding of what is enough evidence in the case of cyber conflicts and cybercrime. Will we know who did it, and can we forcefully link third-party attackers with state sponsors or with states who knowingly tolerate freelance or third-party hostile operators? And then brought or hold responsible for allowing third-party operators to carry out their attacks. A number of second or derivative questions related from the direct attribution to more practical questions that have emerged already. Given the examples that we have right now, given the possibilities for deception, manipulation, third-party and freelance operators, botnets, it's extremely difficult to identify the true source and architect of sophisticated attacks in a way that would lend itself to legal prosecution. Why did they attack and what are they trying to achieve? Did they achieve it? Is there any chance of really knowing, given that cyber attacks are manipulations in itself? Manipulations of vulnerabilities to achieve desired effect. Can we retaliate, and what are the thresholds for national allied response? What about Article 5? In several fora there have been discussions whether to involve the Article 5 that basically attacks armed attacks. I tend to think that we shouldn't exclude application of Article 5 as a response to cyber attacks. Even if its probability is very, very low. And I think we shouldn't overburden ourselves with theories addressing that issue, but leave it open. Leaving this option open is one of the deterrent or components of a deterrent behavior. By the way, 9/11 wasn't in technical terms an armed attack, but but Article 5 was not questioned by anyone. So let's leave it a political decision in the time of need. We may need that flexibility if we really are convinced that real kinetic damage has been produced by activities in cyberspace. Should we have an explicit deterrence policy in order for deterrence to be effective? Is cyber deterrence inherently possible given its ambiguous nature and constantly present element of deception? Again, as my personal insight into this question, I would say that the meaning of deterrence in cyberspace is again too ambiguous to carry any strong relevance. And as it's also impossible to disarm your possible opponent, the only relevant policy approach seems to be that of defense. But again, this is something where I hope further discussions, further explorations of possible ways and means may still make sense. It is my opinion, therefore, that in order to get to a position of really thinking about a viable cyber deterrence doctrine, we still have a lot of ground to cover with the simpler issues of issue awareness, rendering a moral judgment on hacking, formalizing personal liability for immoral, that is wrong behaviors, such as not protecting your own computer. I think here is one of the fundamental questions. To what extent we can address the issue of owning a cyber weapon as a computer, or even more easily a PDA, as owning a gun. We impose rules on owning guns. And things get even more complicated when all these technologies will be planted in everything we have in our households, from refrigerators to bottle openers. In parallel, we have to work with both our formal and informal cyber defense networks and endorse cooperation at all levels between private and public sector practitioners, as the new security challenge in the web also demands a networked solution. In other words, the cyber defense capability that starts from these issues is a prerequisite to cyber deterrence. Now I come to Estonia. In our experience with both deterring the attacks and developing our cybersecurity infrastructure has shown that cyber defense, in order to be successful in times of crisis or war, demands a strong peacetime organization and matching civilian capabilities. This, in a way, is the concept of total defense, where wartime capabilities are also built and maintained within the civilian capabilities during peacetime. I'd like to share an idea that we are working on in Estonia, and for those of you who were listening to my presentation last week at the National Defense University, I beg to stay despite having to go through the same proposal or same idea that I presented there. Simple enough, I start a little bit further on from Estonian defense model. The biggest problem of Estonia is that it's a small country. To be quite frank, even not a small country. Sweden and the Netherlands are small countries. Estonia is a very small country. So that's our biggest vulnerability. But at the same time, I personally do believe it's also one of our biggest strengths. Because flexibility that goes together with smaller size is a great asset under turbulent circumstances. But nevertheless, our citizens and partners alike expect us to be able to carry out certain state obligations, protect our citizens, fight the wars of necessity, collect taxes, offer public services, and so on and so forth. And our public expects us to be able, in a credible way, to raise also our cyber defenses so that those hostile to us could not disrupt our daily routines with a significant price. And when you're really used to go on e-banking, look at e-news and so on and so forth, and when those services are down nationwide for hours, you are frustrated. You start asking questions whether your government is in charge, what's going on, and who is to be blamed. That's exactly what happened in April, May 2007. So if we want to do that, we have to do that in an extremely cost-effective way. How we defend ourselves as a country. We do have a professional military, roughly 3,000 strong, and we are building it to reach the 4,000 target by 2018. But at the same time, we have introduced compulsory military service for all boys to build up a reserve army, at least 35,000 strong. And in addition to that, a voluntary national defense league, very similar to the National Guard in US. This gives us the capability of flexibly addressing our own security threats on the eastern borders of the North Atlantic Alliance, as well as has given us an opportunity to be the greatest per capita contributor of troops in Afghanistan. We participated also in Kosovo, Iraq. Some of the units we deployed were formed on the basis of voluntary contributions from the National League. I think the same approach shall and can be used in the case of cyber defense. So we are willing to employ a similar system or an organization and model to raise cybersecurity, a voluntary cyber defense league. Let me explain. Estonia's resilience to cyber attacks is dependent on the resilience of the cyber infrastructure, most of which is privately owned. In the time of crisis, the enemy will attack your critical public and other important civilian services, such as banking. The Estonian Defence League could start forming cyber defense units, voluntary civil units. They do not have a military objective or a mission. The state does not task them. At the same time, a voluntary movement that can help and can be used by regular state cybersecurity units, either in law enforcement, the National Computer Emergency Response Team, in the defense forces or elsewhere. A strategic reserve in some sense. They will comprise of people currently working in private businesses such as banks, IT businesses or NGOs, and they are the people who are both disciplined and with an active stance towards society, looking for opportunities to give back to volunteer. Most of all, they know that their help is severely needed. Again, this is, at least in part, a lesson learned of the attacks of 2007. Before that, we started to prepare for a national cyber defense capability, forming an informal network of IT specialists in the field of cybersecurity from both public and private sectors, and from the public sector, both from among the military as well as from other state agencies. This informal networked communication among those people, basically form the backbone of defense when the attacks took place. Let me conclude. 85% of the infrastructure of the cyber domain is non-state, in other words, in private hands. So while it's important that the government to take the lead in implementing a comprehensive strategy to contain cyber risks, its main role is to engage and encourage efforts in the private sphere, from corporations to individual users. The government's role is to protect the critical information infrastructure, provide the legal instruments, raise national awareness, improve national computer emergency response team capabilities, and do its part to foster international cooperation. In the private sector, we have to look at the financial institutions, including banks, and encourage them to improve financial security. We have to get the telecoms involved, the service providers who provide online access. It's up to them to ensure the stability of access to online services. And naturally, we have to have the leading IT businesses, including computer security experts, working with us. In conclusion, while cybercrime and security are surely issues that demand national and international attention, and while cyber weapons have been already used by states against other states, then the first response should still be a civilian one. The Internet has become an irreplaceable resource for governance, finance, communications, and other walks of life. It is our common responsibility to ensure the safety and security of this resource. And also, while cyber attacks, weaponization of the virtual domain, financial fraud, and industrial espionage are all very serious and expensive challenges, they are to be tackled in good faith, preserving as many civil liberties and freedoms in the process as possible. Dear friends, if you ask me about just one thing that I consider crucial in cyber defense, then this is the principle of networked cooperation. And that is exactly, dear friends, what we are doing here today. Thank you for your attention.